Hello, I'm Andrew, and welcome to the next installment in the Sicilian Dragon series, where we're going to be looking at the Yugoslav attack, which occurs after e4, c5, of course, the Sicilian defense. Now, knight f3, the open Sicilian. Now, rather than playing knight c6 here, going for the accelerated dragon, or g6, going for the hyper-accelerated dragon, we continue in classic fashion with the move d6. Now after d4, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight f6, and knight c3, followed by g6. We are now at the key branching point where white decides which of the main variations they would like to play. If you're confused as to how we've gotten here, take a look at the introductory video in this series. Now white could play a number of moves. They could play bishop e2, going for the classic variation, bishop c4, g3, going for the fianchetto variation, f4. But today, we're going to be focusing on f3 and bishop to e3, which transpose into the same line, the Yugoslav variation. Now, why is bishop e3 slightly more precise? The reason is that if white plays f3 immediately here, and we play bishop to g7 and they play bishop e3, now black is never going to play the move knight g4 attacking this bishop, because it's clearly defended by the pawn on f3. Now, if we just go back and they play bishop to e3, black may very well play knight g4 and not realize that this is a blunder. So we're inviting black to make a mistake that they otherwise wouldn't if we played f3, which is why I think bishop e3 is a little bit more precise. Now, why is this a blunder? Well, because of bishop to b5 check. Now, it doesn't matter how we block here. We could interpose on c6 and just lose material this way. We're losing the rook. Or we could interpose with the bishop on d7 and just lose the knight like this, because our bishop is actually pinned to our king and cannot reclaim the queen. So once we capture here and white captures back, we are just down a piece. Do not fall for this. It's a very classic mistake that we want to be aware of. So, what should we play instead? We should just continue our development with bishop to g7, and now, after f3, we castle. Why is f3 being played here? Well, f3 is being played here now to prevent knight g4, because white would like to continue queen d2 and castle long. That's why they're developing their queenside pieces nice and quickly. Okay, but here we can play knight g4. In fact, this is a very good move, forcing the bishop out to a square like g5, where it's not particularly comfortable because it can be kicked in numerous ways. And bishop to b5 check doesn't work in this scenario, because once we block, the queen has left the light squared diagonal and cannot pick up the knight. So we probably will win this dark squared bishop, and with our own dark squared bishop placed as it is, we're going to have a dark square dominance in that game for sure. So, as a result of that, after we play bishop g7, white wants to play f3, protecting this g4 square, and after castles, queen d2, and knight c6, we reach another key branching point. Now at master level, the two main moves here are about as popular as each other. And below master level, castles is a lot more popular. Now, castles was the original way to play. It was the old way to play. In Bobby Fischer's 60 most memorable games, however, there's a game, Fischer-Larsen, where he argues that bishop c4 is more precise, which is the other move. Because when we castle, we allow black to play d5 immediately, whereas when we play bishop to c4, we add another defender to the d5 square as white, making it much more difficult for black to play in the center straight away. So we're going to cover, of course, both of these. But let's just have a look at what happens if white plays a number of strange sidelines here. I mean, there are any number of moves they could play here, really, but let's look at just some ideas. They might play knight back to b3. Because this is an idea in a lot of the other Sicilian lines, well, my recommendation here is just bishop e6, looking to attack that knight, and after something like castles, queen c7, you're just going to have a very nice game. You're going to want to launch these pawns towards your opponent's king, maybe push in the center with d5 at some point, and bring your rooks to the d and the c files. This is a little bit of a passive way for white to play and is not particularly challenging. They could play g4 here. Now, again, the move is bishop e6. What's the idea behind this? Well, white hasn't castled yet, so if we get something like knight takes on e6 and f takes on e6, you can see the arrows here pointing out that once white castles, like this, we can go after this weak pawn immediately, and also we have a very strong clamp on f5 with our 2 pawns now on the E and G files. This is one of the ideas of playing g4, is to launch all of their pawns down towards our king. Well, now we've got this square nice and looked after, and after castles we can just play knight e5, targeting this weak pawn immediately. Okay, there is another line here that I want to show you. It's not what I would recommend. It's an old line. It's actually just bishop sacking on g4. The reason this is really tricky, actually, for white is that they walk a bit of a knife edge. They do have to be quite careful here. But if they understand this line well enough, it is more or less refuted. White just will end up better in a lot of cases. But let me show you just one trap. Let me show you how they could go wrong. Let's just say that white castles. Now we take the knight in the center, and we're completely winning here. Why is that the case? Well, white can't actually capture this knight back very easily. If they capture back with the queen, I shouldn't need to explain to you why this is terrible. We just take the queen, and we're doing tremendously. If they take with the bishop, however, we now understand the importance of the placement of this knight on g4, because we can play bishop to h6, now pinning the queen to the king, and even if the bishop returns, we can take that piece because it's defended by the knight and the queen is still pinned to the king. Explore these lines in your own time if you like the look of them and it seems interesting to you. But what I would recommend is bishop to e6. Perhaps maybe bishop takes on g4 in blitz games, faster time controls. But if you want to play really solidly, then this bishop e6 move is very, very nice. And if they castle without taking the bishop, we can claim the knight, and now we're just going to have a very strong bishop pair for the rest of the game. And after something like queen a5, we can apply a lot of pressure here, start going after these pawns, bring our rooks to the c-file, and we're just going to have a very nice, relaxing time there. Okay, let's go back. So, in this position, we played knight c6. We've looked very quickly at knight to b3 and g4. What if they just capture the knight on c6? Well, we capture back, and now they've released all tension in the center before castling. So, after something like bishop c4 and queen a5 and castles and bishop e6, again, we have this idea of looking to capture here, and we will take on doubled pawns in order to have a semi-open f-file and a strong clamp on the center, and we're going to bring our rooks to the b-file, and we're going to start going after our opponent's king. It's a little bit too passive. It diffuses all the tension. This is not very good for white. So what are their 2 main moves again? Well, castles and bishop c4. So we'll look at bishop c4 later, but if castles, I've already mentioned what the key move is here, and it's d5. Now you could play h5 here. The reason being, if you get something like g4, we have this tactic again of takes, takes, takes. We're going after that bishop, so we're going to win that dark squared bishop. And if the bishop tries to retreat, hello, we now have bishop to h6 again, pinning the queen to the king. So you might try that as a little trap, hoping that they might fall into that somehow. But I mean, white should be more prepared than that. They're probably not going to make that mistake. So what you should remember here is to break in the center immediately. And how do you remember that? Well, if there is no bishop on c4 to challenge this center, we want to push d5 right away. Okay, now white does have a lot of options here, but their main options are to take on c6. This is a very common move. To take in the center with their e-pawn, again, another very common move. And slightly less common, but a great idea, is to play queen e1. The idea behind this move is to allow the rook to have the almost open, because there's a lot of tension that is yet to be resolved in the center here, d-file, where it would be staring down at our queen, and we could very easily go wrong here. We'll take a look at that line in a little bit more depth in just a moment. The other idea is king b1, which again is quite a passive move, but the idea is to take the king off the c-file, where we will eventually want to position one of our rooks. Okay, so let's take these one by one. Let's have a look at queen e1, this idea of allowing the rook the scope to potentially threaten our queen in future. Now, knight takes on d4 is a blunder. The reason that this is the case and that it's now about +2 for white is that just all of the initiative passes in to white's court after they recapture here in the center. They're the ones exerting all of the tension down the d-file. Our attack is fizzling out. They are likely to just have a stronger center and more space. And yeah, there's nothing here for black. We can do a lot better. So the other move that we need to be careful about is d takes on e4. It should be very clear why this is a blunder. Knight takes on c6. And now we can't reclaim the knight because of this idea that the rook sees the queen. So obviously if we take the knight, we just lose the queen. We don't want to be doing that. Which means they have just won a free piece. We can play something like, you know, queen c7, getting the queen out of view from the rook, but now, you know, they can just take our pawn. It's attacked twice, and this is dreadful for us. So don't take in the center, and don't take the pawn on e4. The move we want to remember is the move that's going to try and claim the center entirely for us, which is e5, attacking this knight. Now, the knight can either retreat, might go somewhere like knight back to e2. Here, black is just a lot better. Here we want to play e5. And now in this position, we just want to play bishop to e6, developing our pieces, attacking our opponent's king, and after something like knight to d5, we want to chop this piece off and grab this pawn. And we're just going to be a lot better with a very powerful center. So they don't want to retreat that way. Okay, so they could go to b5 instead, but we're still going to push in the center, and we're going to get more of the same. We're just developing the bishop, and once their other knight hops into the center, we can chop this down with our bishop. That's why we put the bishop on e6, not only to exert pressure on our opponent's king, but also because otherwise they would get knight d5 and make this pin a real nuisance for us. So we chop these pieces off, and now we're just doing very fine after something like c4 and queen to c5. Obviously, we do not want to take en passant, because look at that position of white's rook. Still very dangerous. Okay, so the knight doesn't really have an easy square to retreat to, so they're probably going to chop off our knight. And now after we recapture, let's say they take it in the center again. Now, it's very important here to remember to take back with our knight. Why? If we take back with the pawn, it looks like we've got a very strong center, but now notice that this pin is really difficult for us. They're exerting pressure on this pawn. They're exerting a lot of pressure on this pawn, and now we only have one defender because we can't use the knight because it's pinned to the queen. So what are we going to do? We're going to try and defend it like this. But now, the very strong move, bishop to c4. Why is this a problem? We can't take. So our center is just slowly collapsing, and in a position like this, I mean, you know, white is just up a pawn, and again, they have all the initiative. We're about to lose probably one of our best pieces. This is not good for us. So we must remember in this position to take back with the knight. And now if bishop c4, bishop e6, and I've just added a few more moves here, but something like king b1 and rook to e8, or you could play rook to b8. You want to be very careful not to play queen a5 here. In a lot of lines, we need to watch out for this move. The reason being is that when the knight takes in the center and we take the queen, the knight can actually save itself with this check. But also, just in this position, white's a lot better. I mean, they've won a pawn, and you know, again, they have a lot of the initiative. Their rooks are nice and centralized, and ours are not. So be careful about that. Okay, so just going back to this position, our opponent has castled on the ninth move. We've played d5, and if queen e1, we must remember e5, and we will be fine as long as we remember the intricacies of how to capture back in the center after knight takes on c6. When they capture here, take back with the knight. All right, what else can white play? Let's say they play king b1. This is quite easy. This is a passive move. We can just chop off this piece in the center, take in the center again, and now after something like bishop e6, bishop to e2, queen a5, knight into d5, we can just look to diffuse the tension. We take the queen off the board here, and even if they capture here with check, it's fine. We can step over and we reclaim the pawn on e4 with knight takes on e4. And yeah, I just think black is actually slightly better here, even after captures. I just think we have a very nice, solid position. There's nothing to worry about here. So king b1 isn't really that dangerous, but worth knowing about. The other main move to cover, of course, is knight takes on c6. We want to take back, and now if they capture back, we do want to take back with the pawn this time. How is it different? Well, bishop g5 is not exerting an immediate pin on the queen because we haven't advanced our e-pawn. So this is less challenging for us because there's, as I say, just no pin here. And now after something like knight takes on d5, knight takes on d5, queen takes on d5. Yes, we are down a pawn, but this is actually a notorious drawing line. The move to remember here is queen to c7. Aren't we just giving up our rook? Isn't that crazy? Well, yes, but if they decide to take the rook, we want to play bishop to f5, threatening mate and attacking the queen, which means we will get the queen for 2 rooks. And after something like captures, this is perfectly playable for black. In fact, there is a lovely, lovely line that I want to show you here where, okay, so white brings the rook forward to protect against mate here. Now, I love the move e6. Why do I love this move? Because more often than not, the overwhelming majority of times, I have white play g4. Aha, your bishop's trapped. But actually, this is a decoy. This is distracting white from what's more important here, which is this, this diagonal. We can now play queen into e5, and they can't take the bishop. We're threatening mate. So how might this continue? Something like c3. Okay, well, we win their bishop, and after captures and bishop to h6, exerting enormous pressure here. Black is just better. So this is why I love the move e6, particularly if you play it fast enough, because it just naturally invites g4, and it's very difficult to understand how this is so threatening, attacking the bishop and the pawn at the same time, because your opponent might think, well, why can't I just play bishop into d4 here? And then they're going to fall for queen to e1 check. The rook comes back, and they're forgetting about this diagonal. Check, check. This is mate. I mean, they could block one more time, but we're going to just simply have mate there. So if you can remember all of this theory, e6 is a fantastic move to play. What if they don't take the rook? Well, queen c5, and now we can just have a repetition. This is a very well-known draw. If you want to continue playing on, then I would advise taking the queen here on the b5 square, because what it allows now is the rook to come to b8, attacking that bishop, and when the bishop moves, we're going to win that pawn back. The king will be stepping out to d2. Now, this is a draw, but I would say it's maybe slightly more playable for black. I think I would rather have black in this position. So again, if they decide not to take the rook and they go for this threefold repetition of just queen over, queen over, queen over, and you would like to still play for a win, take the queen on b5, and remember rook to b8 and recapturing this pawn here, and that will be nice and lovely for you. So that is what happens if they trade everything off on d5. They could also just play e5 here. Well, we drop the knight back to d7. You can even drop it back to e8. In fact, e8 is slightly preferred by the engine, I think, here. We're going after this pawn immediately, and if f4, it is crucial that you don't play e6. This is a blunder. Why? Well, e5 has already closed off one of your best pieces, and now you've just closed off your other bishop. So you want to remember not e6, but f6, looking to tear things open in your favor. And after something like captures, we're just doing fine, if not better here, in fact. Okay, so if they don't capture back in the center and they don't push with the pawn, what happens? If they go after our bishop, take their bishop on h6, and after queen recaptures, we can take a nice strong center with e5. And yeah, this is just one sample continuation I've included where we needn't fear being worse. We're just absolutely fine here. Everything can trade off in the center, and we'll have a very even end game. All right, so that is knight takes on c6, that is queen e1, and that is king b1. So the last major move to look at here is what happens if they capture back with the pawn immediately. Well, we capture back with our knight, and if knight takes on c6 and we play b takes on c6, we are now very likely to transpose. Let me show you. Knight takes on d5, pawn takes on d5, queen takes on d5, and now queen c7. Recognize this line? You should. Queen takes rook, bishop to f5, queen takes, da-da-da. We're in the same line. You should be familiar with this, all right? So is there anything else they can play? Well, they could play bishop to d4. We want to just contest the center and kick this bishop out with e5. And after something like bishop to c5, bishop to e6, we're just holding our own here. We're doing very, very well. We can even give up the exchange. You might be slightly alarmed that I just advised you to give up a rook, but our bishops are going to be absolutely killer along this diagonal. This is actually nearly -1 for black, so we have an edge. Now, if you would prefer to hold on to the rook, you want to play rook to e8, and after everything trades down on this square, we are down a pawn, but after bishop to e6 and the rook moves out the way, we can take that pawn right back. But hang on a minute. Can't they play b3 and trap our bishop? No, not in this position, because we have e4. Now the king cannot approach our bishop. We are threatening the rook again, and once the rook moves, we will take this pawn, and after recaptures, we can deliver this check, put our rooks both on the e-file, and have a splendid game. This is even. So what that means is we're now returning to what I would consider to be the main line of the Yugoslav attack, which is bishop to c4. Now, I already mentioned this move prevents d5 because white just has it covered way too many times. So let's look to develop our last remaining piece. We want to put that bishop on to d7. Now, if h4 here, just close things off with h5, and if they are insistent on breaking open the center, you're going to remember that you have captures, knight captures, and if the bishop comes back, you just leave that knight here, and if they castle, this is a big blunder. We've seen this motif a number of times. You should know what the move is here now. Bishop to h6, pinning the queen to the king. And so if they don't castle or they don't move the bishop, then they're just going to have an awkward position, and likelihood is our knight will be returning to e5 or will be reinforced by our other knight, and there'll be no getting in here for our opponent, and we'll just be absolutely fine. So that's what I would recommend against any early h4 ideas, just h5. But if they are playing correctly, what they're going to do is castle. Now, what we want to do is bring our rook to c8. There is another variation with a rook to b8, but it's not what I'm recommending here. I'm recommending the classic line of rook to c8. If you have a very well-prepared opponent, what they're going to do is move this bishop back to b3. This is mainline theory. Now, I should warn you that if white plays perfect theory, they will just end up better. The dragon variation has all kinds of challenging lines for white, but if they play absolutely precisely in the Yugoslav variation, then they will just end up with a slight edge, and that's something you have to accept when you choose that opening. But of course, as we've seen, there are numerous ways that they can go wrong. Let's have a look at one of those errors that is very popular here. g4. Well, we can take in the center, and if they take back with their queen, we can win this pawn for free. We're now attacking the queen, attacking the bishop. The piece will have to retreat. We will nab this bishop with our knight, and of course, the reason they play bishop back to b3 is that if they allow exchanges in the center that pull the queen away from the bishop's protection, we're just going to win this piece. So that's very nice. So what if back here they decide to take with the bishop instead? Well, we're going to win the bishop. So they will take with the queen if they're going to recapture at all, and then we will just win this piece, win the bishop, and win the other bishop. And, I mean, this is just absolutely killer. So g4 is a mistake. We want to punish that by immediately capturing in the center. What else can they play? King b1. This is a mistake. Why? We capture, and it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. So two ways they can go wrong very easily in this position with king b1 and g4, where we're going to just trade off and nab that light squared bishop on c4. So what else could they play? They could trade off here, but now, the tension is kind of resolving in our favor. Our bishop is going to be incredibly strong. We now have the potential to make a d5 break in the future more easily. The sample line I've included here is just bishop back to b3 and b5, going after this knight immediately. We can even give up the pawn just to harass this knight and get a killer position like this, where if they take here, we're taking back. And I would say even allowing our opponent to go 2 pawns up, or I should say 1 pawn up, because we can take this one back immediately, we're just going to have a lot of pressure on our opponent's kingside, and they are sure to cave. This would be lovely for us. So they're unlikely to want to capture in the center like that. They are much more likely to play bishop to b3. If you have a prepared opponent, this is what you should expect to see. Now, after bishop to b3, there are only 2 key ideas remaining for us to have a look at. One is knight to e5, and the other is knight takes on d4. Knight to e5 does come with some complications and better positions for white if they know exactly what to play. So I would recommend knight takes on d4, but we will have a look at both regardless. Let's have a look at what happens when we play knight e5. What is the idea here? The idea of knight e5 is actually to remove this b3 bishop by trading off on c4, because once we play knight into c4, we are forking the dark squared bishop and our opponent's queen, so they are much more likely to want to just trade off here on this c4 square rather than allow us to win their dark squared bishop, their better bishop that is exerting a lot of pressure on our position. So if they play h4, again, h5, and if this, we'll get a position like this where we're very happy. So this would be too early for white to start making an attack like this. So we don't need to really worry about h4. The main move is king b1, getting the king again off of the file of our rook. And in a lot of Sicilian lines, we actually sack the rook for the knight here to get our queen to a5. So this serves the double purpose of not only getting off the c file, but also putting the king on a light square, because after queen to a5, if you could imagine this file has been ripped open, we would be threatening to play queen h6 with check. So it's just putting the king in a little bit more of a comfortable position. So after king b1, here comes this idea again of forking the dark squared bishop and the queen, after which we will see bishop takes, rook takes, and g4 going for a pawn storm. So we want to do the same and play b5. Very often in the Sicilian Dragon, when we are castled on opposite sides of the board, it's going to be a case of who can launch their pawns at their opponent's king faster. So b5, and after a move like g3, there are 2 ways to continue here. One is just to kick the knight and give up the exchange in order to tear open our opponent's king. I think there's a game with Wesley So that went this way, and maybe he had the white pieces actually. Well, I can't remember, but I think he had the black pieces and did very well giving up the exchange. Don't take that as gospel. I could be wrong about that. But the other idea is just to drop the rook back to c8. But we do give up the pawn, and now you can start to see why after bishop takes on b5, knight takes on b5, this is just ever so slightly better for white. The engine evaluation for this is plus 1.2 for white, and black hasn't really gone wrong in any major way. They've just tried their best to facilitate the ideas behind knight to e5 back in this position, which is one of the key ideas, playing knight e5 here. So I am recommending the move knight takes on d4 here. Why? Because if they capture back with the queen, remember we have this discovered attack, this discovered idea of playing knight to g4. Now our bishop sees the queen, and we're threatening to win their better bishop. Now they can take the pawn on a7, but after captures, we want to give up our bishop here on c3. Yes, it's one of our best pieces, but we're doing it in order to rip open their king. They have to take back with the b pawn. They can't take back with the queen because of the rook on the c file. And now queen to a5. We're attacking this square twice. We're threatening checks and infiltrations. This is worth the pawn in my view, and I think this is one of the best ways to contest this line. Now, of course, they don't have to take with the queen, they could take with the bishop. But if they take with the bishop, we're just going to go for a pawn storm immediately. And why do I like this line? I like this line because a4 is played very often. allows the bishop to drop back, and it looks like it's sort of challenging something here on b5, making our pawn storm a little bit more difficult, but this is a blunder. Why? Because we can take, and after they take, we can take the knight out of the game, and the knight is the key defender of the bishop, and when they capture back, we're winning the bishop. Okay, but you might be asking, well, what if they don't take the rook, and what if they take our bishop instead? Well, now we can just save the rook, and we're attacking this. We're threatening, to put a lot of pressure here. Our opponent now has an open A file that we're going to be able to take advantage of. We're just doing fantastically in this position. So remember, if you see A4 in this position, take back in a heartbeat. And if they take back with the knight, we want to chop that piece off and fork both bishops. The reason we're doing this is because we want to likely play something like this, protecting the bishop and kicking the rook. But the reason we've positioned the rook here is we want to play knight takes pawn. Now we're threatening the queen and attacking the rook twice. And then their kingside is completely opening up. This would be tremendous for us. Now, they might not play A4 here. They might play A3. They could play something like G4. But in most cases, we are going to continue our pawn storm on the kingside. Notice if they play G4, we're just going after this knight immediately. So what else could they play? As I say, they could play A3. We're going to play A5, looking to play B6. And get to their king as fast as possible. We now have a lead in our pawn storming on their king side, and if something like king b1, we're going to go ahead and kick that knight again, and if they decide to take the pawn, we're going to say keep it. We're going to kick that knight anyway, and once the knight gets out of there, we can play queen a5 attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats. If it wants to retreat to the center, well, now we have e5. If it retreats again, we can even break with d5. We kind of have enough there. If we eliminate this bishop, we have easy access to the king. This bishop can come to e6 to attack any of white's pieces that ends up here. We have enormous pressure on this file. We have a pawn ready to push and another rook ready to swing to the center. And of course, if we can get this pawn off of e4 and get our knight off of f6, then our dark squared bishop opens up as well. So you will just be fantastic here, I think, in this critical position when you play knight takes on d4. I think that gives you the best chance. As I say, if your opponent has reached this position, they are very well prepared. So, I mean, try and explore knight e5 in your own time, but my recommendation would be knight takes on d4. Just a very quick recap here of the two main ideas: e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6. Now they're choosing which variation they want to go in. Remember, we have the Yugoslav attack after f3 as well as bishop e3. Remember, if bishop e3, not to play knight g4 and just play bishop to g7, f3 castles, queen d2, knight c6, and here we have the key branch between castles and bishop c4. If castles, d5, and if bishop to c4, bishop d7, now castles, rook c8, and if you see bishop to b3, my recommendation, knight takes on d4. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for the next video in the series that will be covering f4, the Levenfish variation, which just so happens to be my favorite variation to play against the dragon as white, because black can very quickly go wrong. So check that video out when it comes, because it's very important to know how to contest f4. Let me know in the comments about any interesting lines you might have discovered in the Sicilian Dragon. Take care, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.